That looks good. All right. Once again, welcome everyone. For the title of my presentation, knowing I'll focus on Kouri-Vini and French in Louisiana, I have conveniently lifted the title of Rodolphe Lucien de Dunes' 1911 memoir of the Creole community in New Orleans called Nos Hommes et Notre Histoire, Our People and Our History. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Some sources, as well as strategies for documenting our ancestors. And of course, I've chosen to highlight examples that use our French and Creole names, terms, and sources. I always begin every presentation with this definition of genealogy, which comes from the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And I won't read it to you, you have it on your screen, but you see highlighted just a few terms. One of those being genetic and historical context, which is what we'll focus on today, and in particular, linguistic context in a place like Louisiana, where we have our own heritage languages other than English, very distinctive for the United States. And the other two being biography and the study of communities. While we pursue individual lives, we try to reconstruct the individual lives of our ancestors, we know that we can't study them apart from the communities in which they live, because especially in a state like Louisiana, where we have the most non-transient population in America, our community members in many cases are also our family members. If you remember nothing else from this short presentation, I would like you to keep in mind these 4 ways for improving your genealogical research. 1, situating your ancestors in historical and cultural context, which requires a literature survey. It requires a lot of reading beyond just the sources that we use for genealogy. These could be sources that are historical, cultural, linguistic, legal, geographical, and even religious in nature, utilizing a broad range of documents, both those sources available widely online and things that are available offline, such as parish courthouses, religious archives, institutional archives, and special collections. Given a close analysis to records, and you will see that in 2 or 3 of the micro case studies that we'll look at in just a moment. And of course, applying the FAN principle. This may be a new concept to many of you, but FAN stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. And it's another way of describing cluster research. That is, if Papa, for example, came from a family of 14, you don't focus simply on the records related to your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandmother. You focus on all of the individuals related to that person, because all of those records are potential sources of information. Of course, when we talk about context, I'm sure much has been discussed this weekend of our unique history in Louisiana, the roughly 60-odd years that we are under French control in the late 17th, 18th centuries, and then the brief period again following the 40 years or so that we were under Spanish control. And of course, ever since 1803, with the sale of Louisiana, we have been a part of the United States of America, except for that brief period of time that they used to call the late unpleasantness, talking about the Civil War. And despite the fact that we've been, for the last 2+ centuries, a part of the United States of America, we know that our ancestors have always maintained close ties with the greater Atlantic world, with the Caribbean, places like Saint-Domingue or Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, and other countries. And what abounds here in Louisiana are sources, and particularly those sources that are in the French language, be they published works like the Dunes book that I mentioned earlier, and you see the cover of it here, Benevolent Society records, wills, newspapers. New Orleans, for example, maintained a French language daily newspaper for almost a century called La Belle, or the New Orleans Bee. And even in our funerary traditions, you see here an example of a grave in St. Louis Cemetery, number 2. And of course, in our religious records, for example, the marriage that you see at the upper left, which is for my own great grandparents. Of course, naming. Names are important. We have very distinctive names in Louisiana. Just before we went on air, Jonathan and I were talking about my surname, which is Honora, but it's spelled a little bit different than it would be typically in French or Kouri-Vini. And I always make the joke that when we have things printed, it was too expensive to put E avec accent aigu. So we just said put a literal A there so that it was easy for people. Honor and then A. Well, that's not entirely true. Of course, it's been modified and Americanized over the years. And let's look at this example here of the name Théophile. Théophile. Very familiar to us who are engaged in studying French and in Kouri-Vini. But of course, when we use some of the online databases, when we rely upon census and other records that have been produced by clerks or priests or enumerators who are not as familiar with Louisiana, we can get some pretty creative variations. Look at the censuses here, where in one decade, the name is spelled with a CH, Chofil, which is how the name is often, it comes across in English. You see the other various spellings from 1930, 1920, which is really far off. And that's due to not only to the misspelling, but also to the mistranscription from Ancestry.com. And then finally, you have the little inset that shows the death of Mr. Théophile Allen from East Baton Rouge Parish, in which his given name is recorded as Ghoefield. One way that we can compensate for this, we can get around this, is by using wildcard searches in Ancestry.com, in FamilySearch.org, which is a free service of the Latter-day Saints Church, in which the asterisk replaces multiple letters, and the question mark is used to replace one particular letter, so that if we know or we're reasonably confident that a name like Théophile was spelled with a T initially, and we know that it ends with, say, ILE at the end, but we're not certain of the letters that go between, we could use an asterisk to replace those multiple letters. Of course, for most of us who were reared as English speakers primarily, we would simply say Theophil, Theophil. Well, let's look at this next example, where for us, a name that is pretty simply Norbert Simon. It's very useful to know that not even 2 or 3 generations ago, that name, Norbert Simon, would have been pronounced Norbert Simon, Norbert Simon. And so you see a phonetic rendering here in the 1930 census of that name, in which is spelled N-O-R, B-A-I-R, and then S-E-Y-M-E-A-U. And this is from Lafayette Parish in 1930. So being familiar with the traditional ways in which our given names and surnames are pronounced can be very useful to you when pursuing genealogy. Here's another example. And I think about all the time a set of clients I've had with some paid research, and their ancestor's name, this is not their particular ancestor, but her name was Agathe. And of course, in their own interpretation of our Louisiana names, they have become accustomed to saying Agathe. That's how this name, this is how they pronounce that name, Agathe. But of course, we know that is completely wrong. And I demonstrated this to them using this example of an 1870 census in St. James Parish along the river, where this woman is listed in the household of Daniel and Antoinette Slater as Agathe, A-G-A-T-E, Charles, Agathe Charles. You can see she's an older woman there, 60 years old for that time, and adjacent to her with Juliette Horry and Arthur Cayette and the Poiriers. Well, in the following decade, you see that Agathe is not just a neighbor, but she is actually living at a slightly inflated age of 85 years in the household of the gentleman we saw previously as Auteur Kayet, and literally it's rendered here Auteur Kayet. You see also that we have to sometimes be cognizant of the fact that when these names were rendered verbally, there was some confusion on the part of enumerators as to exactly what was the forename and what was the surname. And so because in this case, his surname is rendered second, what would any reasonable transcriber, be it with Ancestry or MyHeritage or Family Search, they would put into this as Kayet Auteur rather than Auteur Kayet. So this is why using a wide number of sources and considering those sources in unison with each other is important rather than taking just one source. And of course, you see her name rendered there very close to its pronunciation, Agat, A-G-O-T. And ultimately, she was not his mother in this instance, although that would be a reasonable guess. This elderly woman was not just a boarder in the household, she was his aunt. Having been under France and Spain at various points in time, and in a place like New Orleans and some of the other rural posts, having Spanish-speaking clergy extending well beyond the period in which we had gone back to the Republic of France and then ultimately sold to the United States, it's good to be conscious of some of the differences even in the rendering of surnames, so that you know that Grivois or Gravois could be rendered with a B, Benoit with a V, Guidry could very well be entered as Lidri or Yidri. Here's one that's close to my heart, being a Bro descendant, Alexis Bro. Alexis Bro. Sometimes this is, rendered as one continuous word. And a classic example in Louisiana genealogy that I've heard many presenters use is the story of a lady who was looking for her ancestor whose surname was Ondry or Andre, and his name was Manuel Andre, and she searched and she searched and she searched, and finally there was a very wise archivist who said, well, have you considered Manuel Landry, because of the elision that takes place between the L and the A. And of course, sometimes the same individual can be referred to. This example comes from our own family history, multiple different ways, so that Jacques in a French language record could be Santiago, could be Jacobus in a Latin entry, particularly a church entry, and also could be James in English. Here's just one more example of this, taken from the index to the compiled service records for a member of the United States colored troops. And you may or may not know that Louisiana contributed more of these United States colored troops, that is Black men, many of them freedmen, some free men of color, to the Union Army than any other state. And so a man whose name is Pierre Sylvestre is rendered in multiple different ways, some impacted by language, some impacted just by transcription errors. So in the third example, you have the man who's in the same company of the same regiment, but on certain records within that compiled service packet, because these are just the index cards to the actual packet, you have him listed sometimes as S-I-T-O-S-T-A, Siltaster, instead of, say, Sylvester. Of course, he himself would have probably simply rendered that Sylvestre. But you see all of the variations that take place within one record group. Here is another example taken from an actual pension file that was requested from the National Archives for the widow of a Union soldier. In this case, the woman's name was Manon Levenber. Her last partner was an Oneg Americain from Maryland by the name of Nicolas Levenber. And in the final summation of her claim prepared by the pension examiner, who was from Virginia, you note that he had a difficult time getting any sort of a statement from the widow herself because of what he called her gumbo French. You see in the fourth paragraph there that even her owner, Saurazin Marois, he describes as a French Creole, as opposed to the claimant whom he describes as an African Creole. And of course, he spoke no English as well, the only interpreter being a black man in the vicinity who spoke French and English, but could neither read nor write those languages. And so, of course, he was of limited value to the pension examiner. Notice that in the third paragraph, they consider the deposition given by her son, Leon Dominic, as it's rendered by the pension examiner, to have been the best possible evidence because he spoke English better than the rest of her children and the individuals in the neighborhood. Well, when we look at the testimony of Leon Dominic, he mentions the fact that Manon had a child, a brother of his by the name of Arthur, as it's rendered there, Brusle, that she had a son by the deceased soldier whose name was Nicholas, who was still living. But in the 1880 census, the first one taken following this deposition, we find this rural community enumerated. However, Leon Dominic is actually Leandre Dominique. The author Brule, or Brule, Brusle, is actually Bro. And the Nicholas, who's the son of the soldier who died at Port Hudson and is interred at Port Hudson, is not listed as Nicholas Levember or Nicholas Levember Jr. He's actually enumerated as Nicolas, or Nicholas, because he, in a tradition that's very common in Louisiana, his surname that he uses is actually a forename of his father. And of course, we have other records that document that this Nicholas is actually Nicholas Levember. Continuing with this patronymic naming tradition, I want to present to you this family. The husband is a Joseph Henri. This is how his marriage is recorded in the transcriptions of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, the Red Books, if you're familiar with him. And his mother is Marie Aurore, and he marries Marie Hortense, who is a widow, the widow of Clébon. But in another example, just about a year later, in fact, just a few months later, one of their children is recorded under the surname Carlos, because Joseph's forenames are Joseph Carlos, and that is the way in which he's enumerated in the 1870 census shown at the bottom of the page. So already, just within a few months, we find that we have to search for these individuals in the published transcripts of the diocese under two entirely different surnames. This is one family, sometimes Henri, because the husband, shall we say, the patriarch of the family, he's listed under his father's surname when he marries, and then the children are christened or baptized under one of his given names, that of Carlos. Here's another example where we have them listed as Henry or Henri, and you see Joseph Carlos listed with that surname, and his wife. Then you have in the baptism of their son Carlos Jr. or Joseph Carlos Jr., there actually is a surname provided, a maiden surname provided for Hortense, that of Bernard, which was her father's name. And they're listed again as the Carlos household in the 1880 census. But you notice there the presence of a stepson by the name of Andre Young, who's a few years older than the children who are listed as Carlos's. This Andre Young is interesting because we have not in our study thus far seen that name. But we do know, if we go back, that Hortense, when she married Joseph Carlos, she was a widow. She was the widow of Clébon. Well, Clébon was Clébon Young. So do you see how the same individuals are sometimes listed under a forename as a surname, and sometimes listed under a more customary surname if that surname was used. Here we have a later child. Of course, we're accustomed to these families who have children over the course of 15 or 20 or 25 years. This is for their daughter, Henriette, or Marie-Joseph Henriette. And then finally, Carlos is listed as a Daigle. So we have the introduction of a third surname under which we have to search for these individuals. We've had Henri, we've had Carlos. There's a possibility that some of the children are even listed under the surname Joseph, because Carlos's forenames are Joseph Carlos. And then finally, Daigle, which is the name in which they appear in the 1900 census shown there, and the name that the current descendants of this family use. So you see that even though we are quite fortunate, we're quite excited to have the published transcripts of the sacramental records of the Catholic Church, in this instance within the Diocese of Baton Rouge, we still have to mine that source for information, and it's sometimes not readily apparent under the name by which we may know our ancestors. Here's one more example of the this family now pronounces their name generally Kouye. That's it may sound strange to our ears, but that's how they pronounce their name, Kouye or Kuyère, from St. James Parish. And you see the father's name is very consistent, even though the spellings vary, of Elfège Kuyère. And this is over the course of about 20 years, from the baptism of Louis in 1876 all the way through his marriage in 1896. And the mother's name is listed as Aimé Georges or Marie Georges. Now, you don't know how many trees, public trees, exist online where you have an instance like this in which some of the children may be born to, say, Elfège Kuyère and Aimé Georges. Others are baptized and born to Elfège Kuyère and Marie Georges. And individuals who don't take the time to correlate these sources will list what? They'll list Elfège with multiple wives. Huh? Well, you can see there in the final example, which is the baptism of Louis, that she is indeed Marie Aimée. Marie Aimée. So both of these are forenames of hers. So we're not dealing with Elfège and multiple wives who carry the same surname. In fact, this is one individual. The problem is, when we did a quick, simple search in the 1870, 1880 censuses of St. James, of the neighboring parishes, St. John, Ascension, even going into Assumption and some of the other parishes, we couldn't really identify a household of people named Georges, either with the S, more of the Francophone way, or without the S. Well, let's jump well into the 20th century, into 1922, with Aimée, or her name is rendered here Amy Kuyère or Kouye, and she dies at Amesville, Louisiana. You're probably wondering, where is Amesville? Well, that's modern day Marrero. Think about Ames Boulevard, which is a big thoroughfare there. And her father's name is given on the left side of the certificate as George Mack, M-A-C-K, George Mack. And voila, we find them in 1870, we find them in 1880, the household of George Mack. But yet, over a 20-year period of time, in sacramental records of Aimée, her children, even as her children begin to marry, her name is listed as Aimée Georges rather than Aimée Mack. One of the things we also have to take into consideration is diminutive names, or what we would sometimes call pet forms of names, so that a family such as that of our very popular former U.S. attorney here in the New Orleans area, Mr. Kenneth Polite, very familiar to us from the morning and evening news. Well, those researching the surname Polite should keep in mind that they may also want to consider Hippolyte, which is also a surname that's common here in South Louisiana, or Hippolyte. Hippolyte, and that first syllable is simply omitted sometimes, and it becomes Polite, or Cyprien becomes Prien. Even my own surname, Honore. I have a very good friend whose given name is Norey, Norey. His father was Norey, and his grandfather was Norey. But if you go for about 4 or 5 generations before those men, the surname, the given name was actually Honore. And I even have some cousins down on Bayou Lafourche who rendered their surname Nore or Nora, Nore, the first syllable being omitted. And the same with Sebastien or Bastien. Now, name choices can have a particular significance. Sometimes these saint names, even in the absence of, say, a particular date of birth or date of baptism, they can give us clues as to when a person might have been born, or they can be in honor of godparents or grandparents or individuals in the family. The gentleman pictured on your is Professor Medard Hilaire Nelson, who's the namesake of a public elementary school here in New Orleans. And he himself ran a school on an integrated basis in the French Quarter of New Orleans for over 50 years. Well, to anybody in South Louisiana who's familiar with Saint-Médard, the famed expression, il pleut le jour de Saint-Médard, il pleut 40 jours plus tard. If it rains on the feast of Saint-Médard, it's going to rain for 40 more days. Well, he was born on the 8th of June, which is the feast of Saint-Médard. Here's another example. In the 1850 census, you have the household of Louis Mazet, and his wife, whose initials are given as MJ. Well, 20 years later, you have Louis Mazet, who's aged 20 years. His wife is also aged 19 or close to 20 years, but she's not listed as MJ or anything that begins with an M or a J. She's listed as Hortense. Why is this? Why do we find the same woman listed as Marie-Joseph Mazet or Hortense Mazet? Well, to find the answer to this, we have to go all the way back to her baptism. And this is the transcript on the right of her baptismal entry in the records of St. Louis Cathedral as recorded in the published gray books. Let's go back to those 4 ways of improving our research. And one of the things we mentioned was record analysis. That is given a close reading to sources, not simply and we're all susceptible to it. Not simply locating the names of our particular ancestors and running off in a fit of happiness, but actually reading the entire document or reading all of the surrounding entries. One of the things I want you to remember, in addition to those 4 methods for improving your research, is that censuses, in particular, document communities. Censuses document communities. And it's important to analyze the entire document, especially in New Orleans, where I live and I was reared, and I'm sure it's throughout Louisiana. We have an expression called "Dòktòb," and that is, those individuals, sometimes older, sometimes younger, who love to always peep between the draperies or peep between the blinds. They're always in their doorways looking at what's going on in the neighborhood. We call them door poppers. They're always popping in and out of the door to see who bought what, who's going in the house with who, who's not going in the house with who, those sorts of things. And I want you to door pop when you look at censuses. Or another way of saying that is, I'd like you to survey the entire neighborhood and note things like similar names, places of residence, birthplace of parents, occupation, literacy, birth gap. Why literacy? Well, if you're in a rural community and you find that most of the inhabitants of that community are not able to read or write, but you have 1 or 2 individuals who are, well, who do you think probably does all of the letter writing for that community? Who do you think is the one that if they need a deposition made, or they need someone to write out something for the notary's office or the clerk's office, who do you think they're going to go to? They're going to go to the individuals in that community who are able to read and write, either in French or in English. In this case, you have an 1880 census here, and let's say that our focus was the Azéma family, Azéma, Lawrence and Anne or Annie Azéma. Take a look at the census for just a few seconds, and you will probably notice for their entry something interesting, that Annie's father was born in Kentucky, and they happen to live in a community in which there are several other individuals who are either also natives of Kentucky or they have a father, in the case of the individuals in the Archie Motley household who was born in Kentucky, or both parents born in Kentucky. Well, why is that important? Well, for one, Laurence and Annie Asimov, this couple who are in their early 40s, mid to late 30s, look where they live. They are literally sandwiched by several households of individuals who carry the surname Motley. You see at household number 54, of course, those aren't addresses, those are just household numbers in the order in which they were enumerated in the census. You have Archie Motley and his family, household 35, James Motley and his family. In a continuation of household 56, you see family number 70, which is Francois Asimov, probably related to Lawrence. And then in the next household, number 57, you see that of um, Reuben Motley. So if we had to venture a guess, if we had to really go out on a limb and make a guess as to what, say, Grandma Annie's maiden surname might be, we wouldn't be so far off if we were to investigate the Motley surname. And while there may or may not be any records in uh, down the bayou in Assumption Parish, Louisiana, where this census is created, let's just say we had to jump about 40 good years to 1919, when after having migrated up to Chicago, we find her death record. And sure enough, that hunch that we had would have been correct. Her father's name was Archibald or Archie Motley, and her mother's name, Emily Sims. So do you see how even in the event that we had no particular records that documented her maiden name, we could come up with a plausible theory based upon the census community in which she lived. And it just so happens that one of the later Archie Motleys became a very gifted painter, member of the Harlem Renaissance, and he painted his ancestor, Emily Sims Motley. And that's her painting there. I just thought that was so wonderful that we can put a face to a name. Um, it's important to move away from just vital records and church records and to consider records created by local courts or even state courts. These records would include civil suits, criminal suits, and of course, successions. That is the settling of estates after someone had passed. In this instance, a young man by the name of Firmin Gilbert Saint-Cyr, Firmin Gilbert Saint-Cyr, he had to prove or have some proof of his relationship to his deceased mother, having been born a natural child. His mother and father were never married, and his mother primarily used the name Adelaide Joaquin or Adelaide Watkins. Well, in this instance, two very elderly women, Danae Soyer and the widow Edmond Coste, they made this declaration recorded in French, and you see a transcription of it there, that Ferber Gilbert was born in the home of the widow Martin Soyer, down a river from the French Quarter on Montague Street. They give the month and year he was born, the fact that he was baptized, the priest's name, the name of the midwife who delivered him, and the fact that she was no longer alive. Why do you think they provided all of these details, even alluding to the fact that the midwife was no longer alive in 1883, some 40 years later? And they certify that they're just about the only two people who could attest to these facts. Well, they are trying to get as close to the source as possible. They're trying to show that they are the two sole individuals who could best attest to the fact that Gilbert, which is the name he typically used, was indeed the natural son of Adelaide. And of course, this testimony enabled him to inherit a little shotgun house on Columbus Street here in New Orleans. And this declaration was included in her succession packet. Okay, here's a case, a little micro case study that involves multiple sources of information. And this is the 1870 census for New Orleans, and you have the household of Monsieur Paul Tréville, or excuse me, Monsieur le Professeur Paul Tréville, who was a French and English teacher at the Old Courant Institute. And you have his young household there, his wife Hortense, his son Paul Jr., Paul fils, and an even younger son named Ludwig. And I can tell you that Paul Sr., the professor, died 1907. His wife Hortense died 1897. His son Paul Jr., the only one of his children to really live to adulthood, died 1908. And they are all buried in a tomb that belonged to his wife's father's family, the Léon tomb in St. Louis Cemetery number 2. Now, there are many people who, if they say were descended from that only child who lived to adulthood, would take note of the fact that there was a younger brother, but they'd say, oh, well, this Ludwig, he's an uncle, but he's an uncle who died as a small child. There's no need to pursue him. There's no need to research a child who would ultimately die at 6 years old. Well, no, if we are seeking the best possible information on our families, we pursue each and every family member. And the fact that the other members of the family died anywhere from 20 to 30 years later and are buried elsewhere, they were not interred in the same place as little Ludwig, who died at 6. So we pursue him. We look for him in the interment records, in this instance of St. Louis Cemetery number 1, and you see an example of the page there listed entirely in French, and you see the inset with his particular entry. And it tells us some unique information. It says that he was interred in a tomb bearing the inscription in marble, and of course this is written in French, bearing the inscription in marble of François Brunetti. Well, now that's a new surname that's introduced into this equation, Brunetti, but it is a very, very good clue. And so we pursue this. We locate the succession for a Sylvanie Brunetti, who is the wife of François Léon, but in the French tradition, civil law tradition, the succession is listed both under her maiden name and under her married surname of Léon, so it was easy to find it. And we find this little handwritten note that lists not only Sylvanie Catherine's date of birth and date of death. She died at a very young age, 33, but it gives the names of her children and their dates of birth and their ages at the time. And the second child listed is a familiar name to us. It's Hortense Léon. Hortense Léon is the woman who would become Hortense Tréville by marriage. And so what we ultimately are able to find is that Ludwig Tréville, who dies at 6 years of age, is the son of Hortense Léon, is the grandson of Sylvanie Catherine Brunetti, and Sylvanie Catherine Brunetti is born to a free woman of color and an Italian immigrant by the name of Francois or Francisco Brunetti. And we're able to go back an additional 3 to 4 generations just on that clue, the interment place of that 6-year-old uncle, per se, that we may or may not have otherwise considered pursuing. Here is an example from the 1880 census for St. James Parish, and this is our last example. And you have here some adjoining households. You have those of John and Clara Basile and their children, and you have, notice the naming similarity, they have a son named Toussaint, and their immediate neighbor is a carpenter named Toussaint Baptiste and his wife Ernestine. And then the very next household is that of the planter, J.S. Romo. When we take this set of individuals a decade earlier in the 1870 census, we see not only are they neighbors, but the two families are enumerated in the same household, number 247. You have the carpenter. In this case, his name is not rendered Baptiste Toussaint, but uh, it's rendered Toussaint Baptiste. Again, that switching of the name order that sometimes takes place. And rather than Ernestine, his wife is Agnès, or Agnes, we would say in English, but Agnès. And I've seen this several times. Again, it doesn't necessarily make sense to me, but Agnès was often heard to American ears as Ernestine, if you can believe that. And these individuals are still living immediately adjacent to the planter, J.S. Romo. So if you had to venture a guess, where do you think these individuals might have been enslaved if they were indeed enslaved prior to the Civil War, just 5 years before this 1870 census? Well, if you say the plantation, the habitation of J.S. Romo, you would be correct. Here, in a register of freedmen employed on the plantation, not of J.S. Romo, you see not Toussaint, but you do see Agnès, who's about 40 years old, and you see her series of children that includes Louverture, Junot, and others. And you see that Toussaint is on the neighboring plantation, that of the Almond plantation owned by John Burnside. How do we know that this is our Toussaint? Well, by his age, for one, and by the fact that despite his advanced age for that time, he's considered a first-class laborer, the highest rate of pay. It means quite likely that rather than a field hand, he is a skilled tradesman, and he was a carpenter, as we've seen. And how do we confirm this even further? We go back to 1860, right before the beginning of the Civil War, where the Almond plantation was sold to John Burnside, and we see listed there not only our Toussaint, but we have Agnès and her children, Anna and Augustin, who were still below the age of puberty, below the age of, say, 11 or 12 years old. And so they are itemized with their mother. And then you see Clara and Isabel, who are a little bit older and are listed as separate entries in the estate inventory and the estate sale. That Clara is the Clara who is the wife of Jean Bazille in the 2nd-century census entries that we saw previously. We can even take this family further back, 13 years earlier, when a corporate partnership is entered between Jean-Baptiste Armand, the planter, and his children. And you find Toussaint, you find Agnès, and you find their children. You find Agnès' children, Clara and Isabel, and others. And why do I mention this example, utilizing multiple sources, utilizing the census, utilizing registers of freedmen as recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau, utilizing civil records of corporate partnerships and of estate sales of plantations and enslaved people? Because it's always stood out for me that this often used expression when we talk about 19th century lives, especially those of the enslaved and free people of color, oh, little is known. We like to paint with broad paint brushes. We know about the largest South. You see this density map that shows the enslaved population right at the outbreak of the Civil War. You see the famed plantation map of the Mississippi River by Persac, but we're able to go hyper local, if you will, and we're able to reconstruct the lives of individual enslaved people, such as Agnès, such as Clara, such as her son Ambroise, and all the way down to yours truly, because they are direct ancestors of mine. And so that's the last example that we have. I'll remind you again to utilize these 4 methods of improving your research. And I thank everyone for their attention today, and I hope that you have some really good questions.
Thank you so much, Jari. That was amazing.